Our objective this evening is to find out what is our secret spiritual power. Now, this is not individual, by the way. I'm not asking you as an individual what is your secret spiritual power. We could discuss that afterwards, and I'm sure it'll make for a lot of entertaining conversation for everybody else. But here we're talking a little bit more generically. What is our secret spiritual power? Now, we actually started to discuss this already because we're in chapter 18, which is page 76, if you're looking in the book. We already began to discuss the fact that it's part of our makeup, it's part of who we are, it's built into us, it's inescapable that we have love towards Hashem. And we said we have a few questions to ask. How did it get there? And one of the things that we've learned is it got there by way of inheritance, which means because there were people early on in our history and in our lineage who were so incredibly dedicated to Hashem, so the reward that they received was that they should then be in a position to convey to all of their descendants this innate, inherent love towards Hashem. That's the very high level conversation that we had up until this point. Last time, we said, look, you have to understand the spiritual landscape in order to really appreciate this. And the spiritual landscape is twofold. There's our spiritual landscape, in other words, the makeup of our souls, and there is the greater spiritual landscape, which is the different worlds. And we had a little bit of fun talking about the fact that different worlds is not the same as different planets. And when we speak about different worlds, we're not necessarily suggesting that there is a colony of some kind of other spiritual being living on a planet in the neighboring solar system. But different worlds, we learned, and this was really important last week, what defines world is anything that obscures awareness of the truth. See, I say the word truth and Stan walks in. So anything that obscures the truth with a capital T, which is the truth of Hashem's existence. So if I don't see with my eyes clearly that Hashem is not only exists, but that Hashem is everything, if I don't see that, then I'm living in a world. I'm living in an oilam. That means there's some degree of obscuring, there's some degree of blindness, there's some degree of concealment.
We often say about people, he's in his own world.
Right. So depending on how much concealment there is, that will determine which world we are living in. Now, all of that is just by way of introduction to where we have to go this evening, which is what is our spiritual power? And let's layer on one other perspective on this, and that is, does everybody get to access or experience or enjoy this spiritual power that we have? So we're saying that our spiritual power, we've already got a bit of a clue, is this love of Hashem that's built into us, which is great to know and to understand. But what if I'm not so spiritual? And I know that there are some people who say, depending who you're talking to, some people love to tell you how spiritual they are. I'm a very spiritual person. I'm not so religious. Rabbi, I'm not religious, but I'm a spiritual person. If I had what do they say? If I had $1 for every time that somebody said to me, Rabbi, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual, then I'd be a wealthy man. All I need is two things to be wealthy. You know that? $1 for every time a person says, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. And another $1 for every person who says the most important thing is to be a mensch. As long as I have those two things in conversations, I would be a really wealthy man. So anyhow, the point is, when somebody says, I am not religious, but I'm spiritual, that's one thing. But sometimes a person says, I'm not spiritual. It's not my thing. I'm a very pragmatic person. I'm down to earth. I'm a little bit of a cynic. Don't know if you've ever met these people. And it just doesn't talk to me, all the spiritual, ethereal stuff. It's all abstract. It's kind of nice in the books and nice in theory and nice as a Netflix series. But it's not necessarily something that is relevant in my life. So part of what we're going to discuss this evening is, how low can you go? Right? In other words, how low can a person's spiritual state be, and they still have this incredible spiritual resource inside of themselves? So there's two sides to the question. And what we did last time when we spoke about the spiritual landscape was just an introduction to understanding this principle, how broad the spectrum is, and including how low a person could go.
A religious person that just does the doing.
Yes.
Are they spiritual?
Yes, they are.
Even if they don't acknowledge it. That's my question.
And it doesn't have to be a religious person. It could be any person.
No, any person I get, but sometimes
I'm saying it doesn't have to be a religious person. It doesn't have to be a religious person. Okay, there's one other important thing that you have to consider, which is that not only is it a question of are you spiritual, but it's also a more important question, are you holy? Does a person have a holy experience? And they are not the same, but that's not what we're going to discuss tonight. Okay. All right. So let's pull up there, Tanya, and have a look. What does it say? No, we've done that already. Sorry, I'm in the wrong place. Just go a little bit further down. Man. It's putting things on the screen that we don't need, so let's just get rid of them. Okay. So we said we have to obviously understand the four levels: Bria, Yetzira, Asira, Asiya, etc. We spoke about all that. And so what we have to know is this. So I'm just getting the place for us. Here, okay. Sorry, I'm not even in the right place there. Here we go. All right. Va'al kol ponim. Do you see what that is? So if you're looking in the actual book, Va'al kol ponim places us quite near to the bottom of the page. I shouldn't say this. We're just over halfway down the page. Just over halfway down the page. The first word on the line is ve'echad, and we're about halfway through that line. Okay, on page 76. Va'al kol ponim. Al kol ponim means at the very least. Let me make this easier for people to see. So let's just go here. Then it'll be easier for you to follow. There we go. Okay. So va'al kol ponim, at the very least, afilu lekal shebekalim upoishe Yisrael. There's going to be a lot of terminology over here that we're going to have to unpack. So I'm just going to run through the sentence, and then we can unpack the terminology. So first term we have to know is kal shebekalim. Then ufoishe Yisrael, that's going to be our next term, our next expression we have to understand. Nimshach bezivugam, nefesh, de malchus, de asiya. So the translation of that is, at the very least, or as you might say, worst case scenario, yeah? At the very least, even somebody who is the kal shebekalim. Now, it's going to be difficult to translate that just as a literal translation. Kal shebekalim is like the least of the least. Ufoishe Yisrael, which is even worse than that. Can you imagine being worse than the least of the least? How could a person be worse than that? Poishe Yisrael are the sinners of Israel. Nimshach bezivugam, as soon as a person, even if they're in that category, brings a soul into this world through the union of parents, of father and mother, who conceive that child, so they will bring down nefesh, de nefesh. I'm going to give the most generic translation for now. The soul of a soul, the malchus da asiya, from the realm called malchus, translated directly as kingship, da asiya, in the lowest of the four worlds, translated directly as the world of action, shehi madrega hatachtoino shebikedushas hoasiya, which is the very lowest level within the holiness of the sphere of asiya. Now, you are sitting with an English, a bilingual Tanya. So you are very tempted, I'm sure, to try and see what the English has to say, to make some sense of this. And I'm afraid to say that probably if you look in the English, you're going to be no wiser than looking in the Hebrew, because translations are not going to help us at this point. We need to explore, unpack, and define what's going on over here. So the first thing that we have to understand is kal shebekalim, which is likely going to be the easiest thing for us to explain. Kal shebekalim. And poishe Yisrael is going to be very easy for us to explain. But these other expressions, nefesh, de malchus, da asiya, that's going to need a lot of our attention. So, what does kal shebekalim mean? You know, in English we use these expressions.
Simpleton.
Yeah, exactly. In English we use this expression. We'd say that, oh, he's a heavyweight. That person, that rabbi's a heavyweight rabbi. You could use that expression. Where essentially what you're trying to illustrate is that they are very serious. They bring a lot of gravitas with them. You know, they're clearly a player in the higher spiritual realms. So they are considered a big deal. Right? We'll use expressions like that. Big, great, heavy, etc. And on the other extreme, we'll say, that's just a flyweight. They don't even measure in terms of value or contribution, or in this case, spirituality. So kal shebekalim, that represents a person who really doesn't have any real spiritual substance. Now, of course, everybody has spiritual substance. Everybody's got a soul. But they don't have any real gravitas. They don't have any real force behind their spirituality. They're kal shebekalim. Here's another way to look at it. Another way to look at it is this. We've learned in Tanya that one of the most valuable things for spiritual growth is something called da'as. It's something we see early on in Tanya. The Alter Rebbe spoke about it already in chapter 4. In chapter 3, he already introduced it for the first time. Da'as. Da'as means the capacity to take an abstract idea and to integrate it into your reality so well that it is real now for you. That's what da'as means. So, in today's world, people will speak a lot about visualization. If you can visualize something, that it's a very moving experience, and you could use that as a meditative practice, or you could use that as an opportunity to shift yourself out of either an anxious state or a stressed state, or whatever the case, by visualizing something which is happier, better, more wholesome, etc. Das is more than just simple visualization. Das is when you've spent time, you've learned about something, you've networked. When I say networked, I mean networked your brain to be able to put together different ideas that apparently seem unrelated, and then when you study further, you see how they come together. So you have like a really thorough, deep, meaningful appreciation and understanding of something. Then you have an invitation to da'as, which is to take all of that theoretical information and integrate it into your life so it becomes real to you. When a person experiences da'as, meaning when a person truly understands the spiritual content that they are involved with, then their experience of Hashem or their soul is very real. Real means you can almost touch it. It becomes almost tangible. So the word for that is something which is heavy. What does heavy mean? It's got substance. It's got mass. It's real. Kal is the other end of that spectrum. Kal means it's light. So ever tried to, for example, look after anybody ever asked you to watch their luggage in the airport because they just got to go to the bathroom for a second, right? So nowadays, everybody's luggage has wheels. It's not even a question. People forget that not all that long ago, suitcases were things you used to lug around with a handle, right? I'm convinced that's why they weren't so strict about the weight for flights in those days, because you couldn't have too much weight because you could never carry it. Mm-hmm. Now that they've got wheels, they've got to start saying, okay, you can only have so much weight. So somebody gives you this big, heavy suitcase, the old school suitcase with a handle, and says, do me a favor, can you look after this while I go to the bathroom for a few minutes? And they come back. How high is the likelihood of that suitcase disappearing?
Little,
because it's heavy. It's not easy to make it disappear. Today, you've got a wheelie, anybody can walk past, hop it, go. So what does that tell you? When something is heavy, it's going to stay where it should. If something is light, it could easily disappear, it could fly away. Somebody comes over to you and says, do me a favor, look after this helium balloon for me. Right? So first you've got to make sure that when they hand it over to you, you actually get it. Because if you miss that moment of the transfer of the helium balloon from the one person to the next,
gone.
Goodbye, later, that's it. And if you, for one moment, just let go of your grip, that's it. Because it's light. Light means things that just float away and disappear. So on the one end of the spectrum, you've got somebody who their Judaism, their awareness of Hashem, their connection to Hashem is so present. It's so real. It's so in their life. On the other extreme, you've got somebody that it's kal.
Nothing.
It's nothing. It comes, it goes. I have my moments. Sometimes I'm inspired, not so inspired. I care about it. Maybe I don't care about it. I'm focused on it. I get distracted from it. Kal shebe kalim means it's not even a feature. It might flit into their lives on occasion. It's not a feature. They're not living with their soul. They're not living with their relationship with Hashem. They're not living with a connection to something more meaningful than just the next meal I'm going to eat. So you'd think that somebody who is at such a superficial spiritual level will not have the capacity to transfer to their children this inherent love of Hashem, because it feels like you don't even have it yourself. How can you give what you don't have? So that's the first thing. Even the person who has the most tenuous, loose connection to their Judaism is still part of this unbroken chain of the transmission of the innate connection to Hashem that we all have, our secret spiritual power. Not only that, but even Poshei Yisrael. Now, you remember what we do on Yom Kippur, It was al chait and al chait and al chait. And we use the expression chait most of the time. And then occasionally we also throw in other verbs as well. Avinu, not the one with an aleph, that's our father, right? Avinu with an ayin and a vav instead of an aleph and a base, which means we corrupted or we veered off the path. And sometimes we use the expression poshanu, right? Right? Poshanu. What does poshanu mean? It means we were posheya. A posheya is essentially a criminal. It's essentially a criminal. What's a posheya? A person who does something maliciously, intentionally. That's not the person like, oops, I didn't realize that I'm not supposed to say this, do this, go there, touch this. This is the person who says, I know I'm not supposed to, and I'm going to do it anyway. So what level of connection does a person experience with Hashem if they're posheya? If they are rebelling against Hashem? Let's put it into terms that we could all relate to. So somebody is driving their car and they weren't looking where they were going and they bump into the back of your car.
Well, you could be murdered for that in our days.
Yeah, it's true. This is true. Okay, God forbid. So somebody bumps into the back of your car. What happens? You get out, they get out, and what do they say? I'm so sorry. It was a mistake. It's a mistake. Didn't mean to do it. And then you exchange numbers and all that kind of stuff. Weiter gefahren. But what happens when a person sees somebody on the side of the road who they feel that person belongs to a religion that they don't personally approve of? And so they decide to floor it and to ram into that person.
That's posheya.
That's a posheya. That's a posheya. That's a criminal activity. That person will be arrested and they'll be prosecuted, hopefully. Right? Because they deserve to be prosecuted. So now let's ask the question. Okay, this is going to be like stretching the point to make the point. Do you think it has ever happened in the history of the world that from a bumper bashing, two strangers became friends? I think that's ever happened in the history of the world.
I think there are
I'm sure it's happened. I'm sure it's happened.
Even marriages
I was going to say,
are
wouldn't even surprise me if they married each other.
Yeah,
Right?
word of
Wouldn't even
marriage.
surprise. It can happen. Why? Because it's not fundamental relational breakdown in such a... It's unfortunate. It's a mistake. I wasn't paying attention. This or whatever. You can get around that. You could still have a relationship. You could even end up having a lifelong relationship. You could even end up getting married. But in the second case, the posheya, they're not going to have a relationship. First of all, chas v'sholem, the person doesn't survive. There's nobody to have a relationship with. But even if they do survive, this is somebody who intended maliciously to harm. What, you're going to build a relationship out of that? So posheya, what we call over here, Poshei Yisrael. We're not talking about somebody over here who once did something they shouldn't have done. I'm not saying they once made a mistake. They knew they shouldn't have done it. They did it. We're not talking about that. Poshei Yisrael means people who are on a mission to go against what Hashem wants. So you'd think, look, you can't have this connection, surely. Your whole life is focused on doing exactly the opposite of this. Your life is focused on disrupting that connection. And I'm sure at this point, every one of us could pause for a moment and think of somebody who we're convinced falls into this category because of the damage that they have done to the Jewish people through their behavior and through the things that they've said in a public forum, etc., etc., etc. It's easy for us to say, so-and-so is Poshei Yisrael. And therefore to say, as I've heard people say multiple times, they should be excommunicated from the Jewish community. They should not be considered Jewish any longer because of what they've done. Here, what does the Alter Rebbe tell us? This person still has the capacity to transfer to the next generation. Not only do they have the capacity to have it within themselves, they even have the capacity to transfer to the next generation this deep spiritual connection to Hashem. It's a mind-blowing concept. And the reason, which we're not going to get into in much detail over here, is because if it's not something of your making, you don't have the capacity to break it. If Hashem decided to implant this inside you, you do not have the talent, you do not have the capacity to be able to undo it. Okay, now, everybody will acknowledge, though, that if somebody's at a very low spiritual level, it's very unlikely, it's not impossible, because nothing is impossible. It's very unlikely that the kind of soul they'll bring into this world for the next generation is going to be a pretty elevated soul. That's unlikely. Could it happen? Of course it could happen. Abraham was born to idolaters. Of course it could happen. Rivka was born to idolaters. Of course it could happen. Rachel and Leah were born to idolaters. Okay? So it is always possible that you could have somebody who is in a terrible spiritual state themselves and yet could bring a soul into this world that is a super soul, of course. But that's rare.
How about converts? Converts, I would also believe.
No, a convert's a totally different concept because you're making a judgment that if a person converts that they are a lower soul, which is not the case.
No, not that they're a lower soul. The opposite is that somewhere along the line, there would have been a Jewish spark somewhere along the line that has been carried down to generations.
Oh, I hear what you're saying.
And they get re-sparked
Okay,
again.
so that's another whole conversation which we're
Okay.
dealing with right now. But it's a fascinating conversation that deserves its own attention, which is the nature of the soul of somebody converts genuinely to Judaism. Fascinating conversation, and it's very worthwhile to have. Absolutely, it's very worthwhile to have. But it's not what we're focused on right now. But it's an exceptionally interesting topic, so it deserves its attention. So you'd think that logically, if a person is at a very poor spiritual level themselves, in all likelihood, they're going to bring into this world a soul that is at a very low level. So he's going to address that. So he says these kinds of people, they can bring a soul into this world, which might be nefesh, de malchus, de asiyah. Now, in order to understand that, we have to do two things. First, we have to define nefesh. Asiyah we already spoke about previously, so we have some sense of what that is. So first we've got to define what nefesh is, and then we've got to understand the system that we're describing over here so that we can pinpoint where in the system we're talking about. Make sense? Okay. So if I had to ask you what nefesh is, you would say soul. Which is a little unfortunate because if I would ask you what neshama is, you would say soul. So obviously that tells you that neshama and nefesh have two different words in Hebrew because they're two different things, as opposed to in English where we don't have that level of appreciation of spiritual. English is not a spiritual language. It really isn't. So it doesn't have great vocabulary for profound spiritual concepts. A fascinating, and that's how often things get lost in translation, because you've got Torah language which is speaking about highly developed spiritual ideas, and we're trying to borrow English terms to explain what these things are. A lot of the time it really falls flat. So what is nefesh? It's like this. The soul is a 5-layered organism. Okay? And each of those layers has an identity of its own. So even though what you're saying is accurate to say that it's a piece of a soul or part of a soul, it's not the full story, because it's really a soul as that soul lives at a certain level or reality. Okay? So if there are 5 layers or dimensions of the soul, the very lowest out of all of them is what we call nefesh. But it's not as simple as that, because each level of the soul has 5 levels within it. Which means, what's that? Which means that you could have the nefesh of the nefesh, or you could have the ruach of the nefesh, or you could have the neshama of the nefesh, etc. So if you're talking about nefesh as the lowest dimension of the soul, and then you're talking about nefesh, the nefesh of the nefesh, then you're talking about the lowest level of the soul. Let's put that into relatable terms. Let's say that a person has a company. They're running a company. And in their company, obviously, there's a hierarchy. So there is, for example, the founder of the company, the CEO, and the CFO, and the COO. And then you have the whole management team. And then you have the people who are the office workers. And then you have the people who are the sales reps out in the field. And then you have the cleaning staff. So everybody will acknowledge that these are not equal. The different departments are not equal. As much as they're going to go on and on about the ethos of this company, that everybody is treated equally and it's inclusion and ahin and all those wonderful things, at the end of the day, the reality is they are not equal. Because if you really believed in inclusion, you'd have the janitor deciding on the budget for the coming year.
Getting paid
So
the same.
exactly. So we acknowledge that there's a hierarchy. Now within that hierarchy, there are sub-hierarchies, meaning if I'm in the world of management, not every manager is necessarily the same. You might have the MD of the company. You might have the person who's the sales manager. And there's a difference between them. In the cleaning staff, you might have the person who is the overall groundsman or maintenance manager or something like that. And then you could have the person who is the floor mopper, right? So we can acknowledge in any system that there are subsystems inside a system. It's no different in the neshama. So the lowest level of the soul is called the nefesh, but the nefesh also has a range. And the lowest part within the nefesh is what we call nefesh de nefesh, right? The nefesh of the nefesh. What does that mean? Okay, so let's try and understand to the best of our ability what this is. Generically, nefesh is the part of the soul that inspires us enough to behave the way that we should, as opposed to next level up, which is called ruach. Ruach is the part of the soul that gives us the capacity to have an emotional attachment with the things that we should. So if somebody loves Hashem, which happens to be one of the 6 mitzvahs that you can do 24/7, so it's obviously a big deal to get it right, because it's a mitzvah you can do all the time and are required to do all the time. So if a person has love of Hashem, that tells us that they have activated a more mature part of their soul, the ruach part of their soul. That's how they have love of Hashem. And if a person understands a little bit about Hashem, then they have obviously activated the neshama dimension of their soul, because the brain is not capable of understanding God. So you need a neshama dimension to be able to understand God. So you're activating your neshama level, and so on, and so it goes. So within the world of Asiya, which is the world of in the world of nefesh, which is the world of me doing what I should, there's a range. Sometimes I do what I should mechanically, robotically, because this is what I'm supposed to do. I'm some kind of AI that's just going through the motion because that's what I'm supposed to do. And you see that, by the way, you definitely see that in Jewish practice, that there are people, they may include us, but we don't want to be judgmental, they may include us, who simply go through Jewish things automatically. It's almost like without thinking. That would be nefesh de nefesh at work, which just means there is zero depth, there is zero intention, there is zero connection, but at least I'm doing what I should. And that's a good thing. So that's nefesh de nefesh. That person who's kind of almost like a spiritual zombie. They're going through all of the motions without any of the connection, at least feeling of connection. Connection is Hashem's business. Feeling of connection. Okay, so that's in the soul landscape. But then we have the landscape of the worlds, right? So we said that there are 4 worlds. Atzilus is at the top, Bria lower, Yetzirah lower, and Asiya is the lowest dimension, the lowest world, the lowest reality, the right? Which happens to be where we live. I don't know if you've noticed this. We happen to live in the least spiritual echelon of the whole system. So effectively, it's hard for us to relate to as South Africans, but if you've ever lived in Europe or in the United States or the UK or any of these places, you'll appreciate this. We are the basement of the system. You know, in the basement, there's like no light. It's below street level. It's the guy who got the 3rd-class ticket on the Titanic. You know, is below the waterline, is in the bowels of the ship. That's Asiya. That's where we live. The lights are out. And maybe nobody's home. Now, in Asiya, in the same way as the soul is an organism within an organism, a structure within a structure, in exactly the same way, each of these 4 dimensions, Atzilus, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, has its own system. It's not just an entity. It's a complex entity. And it's got its own system. Now, in each of these realities, in each of these worlds, there are what we call 10 sephiros. 10 sephiros means that there are 10 different energies that are the engine of that particular reality. And it's no different for a human being, because a human being has 10 koichos hanefesh, that the 10 faculties of the neshama that operate at the nefesh level, and the ruach level, and the neshama level, etc. So in the same way, there are 10 energies that Hashem used in order to create everything, but those 10 energies are also the substructures of every reality. Okay, now if that's sounding like really, really complicated, let's simplify it. In our minds, let's create a system. This has got nothing to do with what we're talking about, but it is metaphoric for what we're talking about. Let's create a system. So let's create a system where a person needs to get something done. They've got a particular project, and they need to get that project done. So in order to get that project done, hopefully they have a good system. If you don't have a good system, the project's not going to happen. Would you agree with that? Okay. So let's create a very simple linear version of the system that you need in order to get the project done. So what's the first thing that you need in order to make a project happen? The very first thing that you need.
Have a project.
You have to have a project. Exactly. The first thing you need is a project. So where's that coming from? So the first step in this process is the step of innovation. Right? If I don't innovate, if I don't have an idea, if I don't have a project, there's no system to work with. Which means that actually the beginning of the process is I have to want to have a project. Because if I have no interest in having a project, why would I innovate a project? Why am I looking for trouble? So clearly the beginning of the system is what I want, which in turn will then make me think about it until I innovate. I come up with the idea, okay, this is what I'm going to do. Then what's the next thing I need once I have the original idea? What do I need next? I have to create a plan. It's all very well for a person to say, I have a project. What's my project? I'm going to, who knows what, I'm going to deal with all the potholes in Gauteng. Okay, great. It's a great idea. What's your plan? So the next thing you do is you have to have a plan, which means you actually got to think about this. And not just think about it in your own head. You actually have to get some real world information that you could use in order to develop your project. Because if it's all in your head, it's a complete waste of time. So that means you're going to have to do some research, and you may have to consult with some experts in the field, etc., etc. Once you've collated all of your information and all of your research, then your next step is you're going to have to take all of that research from how it sits in your head as a theory, and you're going to have to put it into a plan for the project. So up until that point, the plan was sitting as an idea in your head. Now you've got to reach the point where the plan is actually on paper, where it's actually, or in a PowerPoint in today's world, or whatever the case is, so that it's actually relatable for people, presentable to investors, or whatever it is that you need to do. Then the next thing, which is really important, which people don't necessarily think of, once you've got that whole plan together, you actually now need to have passion for this project. Because if after all your research and after all your planning and strategizing, if at the end of that you feel, oh my gosh, this is not for me, then that's the end of your project. What has to happen is you need to come out of that stage feeling, wow, this is incredible. Because then you're actually going to go ahead and you're going to do the project. Now, the problem with saying, wow, this is incredible, is you could go a little bit wild. And you could get ahead of yourself, and you could be a little bit too enthusiastic, and perhaps you could take high risks because you absolutely believe in the project. So the next thing you're going to need to do is to ring fence your project just to make sure that it's safe and that it's doable. So to make sure that you have the money, make sure that you have the permits, make sure that you have the materials or whatever it is that you need in order to do the project. Right? Once you've got that in place, so it will go. And all in all, if you really work this through using a template from Jewish spirituality, you'll find that there are 10 major steps to any project. So we've looked at the first, 5 of them. There are 10 major steps to any project in order for it to actually work. Why is that? Because the entire system of existence is a 10-phased project. So therefore, everything is going to operate in a 10-phased project because everything exists against the master slide, which is how Hashem created at the beginning. So that's the template for existence. So it has to be replicated. If you want anything to work, it's got to be a replicated version of the master slide that Hashem created. Which means in every world, there obviously have to be 10 steps, 10 energies, 10 parts to the structure. Otherwise, the structure would have collapsed. The very last or lowest part of any project is execution. Now, it's ironic to call that the lowest part of the project. Definitely the last part of the project is execution, right? Because you've got to get all your ducks in a row in order to be able to execute. But it is a little bit ironic to call that the lowest part because, what do you mean lowest? This is what I've been dreaming of. This is what I've been waiting for. Yes, of course. But now it's no longer a dream. Now it's just doing the stuff, which is far less... Correct, which is far less complex and far less exciting than when it was sitting in your head as an idea that you were developing, right? The amount of resource that you needed to be able to generate this idea, motivate this idea, strategize this idea is far more complex than when you're telling the guy, do me a favor, just hang the picture on that wall. Even though that's execution, right? So that tells you that in any system, the last layer of the system, which is the most practical layer of the system, we call that Malchus. Malchus is the very last step in the journey. Why do we call it Malchus? Because if you have, and we don't know this because we live in a modern world, so we don't relate to these things. The only thing that we have in today's world is people saying, not my king. We don't have the concept of a king. So the idea is if you lived in a monarchy, what used to happen is you had the population, which could have been hundreds of thousands of people. There weren't really millions of people in typical kingdoms in the old days because the population wasn't that great. But let's even say there were millions of people. And their entire relationship with the king was almost non-existent. They did not know the king personally. They never got close to the palace. The king didn't come into their world. There was almost no relationship between them, except when the king needed them to execute a mission or a strategy or a project. That's when they became relevant. So that's why when we're talking about the point of execution, we call it Malchus, because that is the interaction that the world has with the king. In the same way, if I'm the genius of this project, the interaction the world has with me is not with my genius, it's with my actual production. So that the recipients, the playing space of where this all happens is quite divorced from where it was all created. So therefore we call Malchus the lowest level within any system. So now, we're describing over here the possibility of a person who is way off their spiritual mark, and yet they can bring into this world a soul that, yes, admittedly, is a nefesh level soul. So it's right at the bottom of spiritual sensitivity. Not only that, it's a nefesh de nefesh soul. That means even within the realm of people who are spiritually disconnected, this is somebody who is especially disconnected. And where does the soul come from? Malchus, the lowest level of Asiya, the lowest world. In other words, they will produce effectively the least impressive soul that you could ever imagine. That's who this couple is going to bring into the world, because they're living a misaligned life. They're not connected to Hashem. So inevitably, this is the kind of soul that they're going to bring into the world. And then he puts a caveat straight away, which he says, Shehi, that this Malchus of Asiya is Madrega HaTachtoino, is the lowest level, Shebekedushas Hoasiya, in the holiness of Asiya. Now, you could easily gloss over that expression and say, okay, I get it. Basically, what you're saying is it's the lowest of the low. I heard it already a few times. You said it in various ways. Nefesh to nefesh. You said Malchus to Asiya. You said Madrega Tachtoina. Like, hello, you told me. You got your point. I hear you. This is as low as souls get. And then he throws in a very important caveat, which is Kedushas Hoasiya, the holiness of Asiya. Right? So you picked that up, right? Kedushas Hoasiya, the holiness of Asiya. What does that mean? So here's the thing. In the world of Asiya, which is our reality, it's the only reality that has the possibility of dichotomy. Let me explain what I mean. Imagine for one moment you were living one world up. Now, one world up is not like taking a lift and going up a few stories or getting onto Artemis and flying past the moon. One world up is a quantum leap in terms of spiritual experience and awareness. But let's assume that we were one world up. There would only be holiness there. No Yetzer Hara, no Satan, no angel of death. And it was basically nothing that interferes with connection to Hashem. It's just a blockage of awareness of the depth of Hashem. That's what's still called a world. There's no bad people living in that world of Yetzirah, which is the next world up. There's no evil forces. There's no evil inclination. None of that. It's just Kedusha. It's just holiness. When you come down into our world, which is the world of Asiya, where you can be guaranteed every single minute of every single day, something is being broadcast on the news somewhere in the world that says there is evil in this world. All day long. So you could make the mistake of thinking this world has no holiness. Because my gosh, you look around and you just see so much darkness and so much devastation and so much disrespect and so much destruction. So it's really important for us to know that even in this world of Asiya, there is Kedusha, there's holiness as well. I might not experience it here, tangibly, in my reality, but I have to know that the structure of this world is 10 Sephiros. It's got a holy backbone. It's got a holy skeleton that all of the dirt of this world covers. So where does the soul come from? It might come from the world of Asiya, but it's only going to come from Kedusha. It's only going to come from the holiness within the world of Asiya. No souls come from impurity. That's really important for us to know. So in other words, even if the people who are the producers of the soul are people who are living in a state of impurity because they just fob off the whole religion thing, Kal Shebekalim, or they actively oppose the whole God thing, Poisha Yisrael, and therefore as a result of that they only gain access to the lowest possible neshama that could come down, you have to know that neshama still belongs in the world of Kedusha, still belongs in the world of holiness. Now why is that so important? Because that little bit of information, knowing that this highly stunted soul still lives in the world of holiness, means that it can never be a stunted soul. Let's put it this way. Just try and angle it in a different way. Let's say that you've got a person who grows up in an incredibly challenging environment. So let's say that the parents are abusive, God forbid. Let's say that the parents are addicts. Let's say that the parents have a terribly toxic relationship. And there's no money. And they live in a bad neighborhood. And the child can't get into a decent school. And. So that child's going to obviously have what we would call a disadvantage, a good word. A massive disadvantage. Now, what happens if this child happens to have an incredibly high IQ? What happens if this child happens to have an incredibly good heart? Then maybe their environment is going to hold them back. But one day, they can break free of that environment, and then you can see who they really are. So all you need is that seed of goodness, or in this case, the seed of holiness, to potentially germinate a whole reality that is fundamentally different from where they started. That's what he wants us to know. Even in the case of the person who has completely wrecked their life spiritually and therefore has had such a negative impact on the soul that they bring into this world, etc., however you want to frame it. At the end of the day, as long as it's from Kedushas Ha'asiyah, as long as there's a spark, a seed of holiness, a seed can produce something which is infinite. And we need to know that about a person's neshama as well. So that's really our secret spiritual power. So we all have at the very least, a kernel of holiness that nothing can stop it from developing and succeeding. And that's what we're going to learn about a little bit further in the next piece, where he's going to explain very fascinating. You're going to have to be wide awake, please, next week, because he's going to explain very fascinating concept how in the tiniest kernel of holiness, you could actually contain almost like an infinite power. Very profound concept for us to get our heads around, which we'll learn next week. Please God.